Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On tonight's show, I'll be covering part 5 of Bernal Diaz del Castillo's The Conquest of New Spain. I'll just be narrating this last section, which is the march of the Spaniards to besiege Mexico on December 28th, 1520. And the final conquest took place August 16th, 1521. On the day after the Feast of the Nativity, we set forward to Tezcuco with our full force and accompanied by 10,000 of our Talascan allies. On the same night, we halted in a part of the territory of Tezcuco, the inhabitants of the place supplying us with provisions. The next night, we halted at the foot of the ridge of the mountains, having made a march of about 3 leagues. We found here a very severe cold. Early the next day, we ascended the mountains, the bad roads through which we were made more difficult by cuts, dikes, and trees and the like, which required the utmost exertions of our allies to remove. Proceeding thus, however, with much regularity and precaution, we reached the summit, a company of musketeers and crossbowmen being in our front, and our allies clearing the way for the cavalry. Descending a little, we came to that part from whence we discovered the whole extent of the city, lake, and plain of Mexico, with all its towns rising as it were out of the water, and here we returned thanks to God for permitting us again to behold the city. We now observed signals made by smoke in the different places towards Mexico, and a little further on we fell in with a body of the enemy who were posted at a bad pass, where a broken wooden bridge crossed a deep water cut. We soon drove them from thence, and passed over without difficulty, the enemy contenting themselves with shouting at us from a distance. Our allies pillaged as they went along, contrary to the inclination of Cortes, who was not able to restrain them. We halted for this night at a town in the territory of Tezcuco, which the inhabitants had abandoned. They had got intelligence by some Mexicans we made prisoners in the last skirmish, that large bodies of the enemy waited for us in front, but it afterwards appeared that they had separated in consequence of feuds, and indeed a civil war which existed between the Mexicans and those of Tezcuco. The smallpox also, which was at this very same time destructive to the country, contributed in a considerable degree to prevent their armies from assembling. On the next morning we again set forward on our march for Tezcuco, which was distant about 2 leagues. But we had proceeded a very short distance before one of our patrols came to us with intelligence that 10 Indians were on the road with signs of peace. The whole of the country was also through which we marched exhibited every sign of the most perfect tranquility. When these Indians arrived, we found that they composed an embassy consisting of 7 chieftains of Tezcuco. A golden banner borne upon a long lance was carried before them. When they came near us, the banner was lowered, and they bowed their bodies. Addressing Cortes in the name of their lord Cocovacin, a prince of Tezcuco, they then requested to be received under our protection, inviting us into their city, and presenting to us as a token of peace their golden banner. They utterly denied having any part in the attacks with which we had been threatened, and requested that no injury might be done to their city by us or our allies. 3 of these ambassadors were personally known to most of us, for they were relations of the good Montezuma and captains of his guards. Cortes earnestly requested the Talascan chiefs to prevent their people from pillaging, and his wishes were strictly attended to, excepting only in the article of provisions. It clearly appeared that this embassy was a mere pretense. Nevertheless, the ambassadors were allured that every protection should be afforded to that country, but were at the same time told that it could not be unknown to them how above 40 of the Spaniards and 200 of our allies were put to death within their territories when we retreated from Mexico. For the loss of lives, Cortes said no restitution could be made, but the gold and other property they might return. The reply they threw the blame upon the prince who had succeeded Montezuma, who they said received the spoil and sacrificed the prisoners. Cortes therefore found that little was to be got from them, and we proceeded to a village on the outskirts of Tezcuco named Guatinchati or Huachtulan, where we halted for the night. On the ensuing morning we arrived at Tezcuco, and immediately remarked that neither women or children were to be seen, and the men appeared as if they were meditating some mischief against us. We took up our quarters in some buildings which consisted of large halls and enclosed courts, and received orders not to quit them, and to be very alert. Alvarado, Dioli, and some soldiers, whereof I was one, then ascended to the top of the great temple, which was very lofty, in order to notice what was going on in the neighborhood. We observed that all the people were in movement, carrying off their children and the effects to the woods, the reedy borders of the lake, and to a number of canoes collected for the purpose. Cortes now wished to seize the chief who had sent him the embassy, but found that he had fled to Mexico with many other persons of rank. We posted strong guards for the night, and in so large a city there were many different parties and factions, and those persons who were adverse to the present chief having remained, Cortez the next morning sent for them, and inquired into the state of their government. They assured him that their present chief, Cocovatzin, was a usurper, having murdered his elder brother, Cucuchka, who was supported only by the prince then on the throne of Mexico, and whose name was Guatemotzin. They pointed out that youth was the right heir, and he was immediately conducted into the presence of Cortez, by whose order he was baptized with much solemnity, being called after his godfather Don Hernando Cortez, after which he was appointed Lord of Tezcuco. Cortez, in order to retain him in our holy faith and in the interests of Spain, and also to instruct him in our language, ordered 3 persons to attend upon him: Antonio de Villarroel, married to the handsome Isabel de Ojeda, a bachelor named Escobar, captain of Tezcuco, and Pedro Sanchez Farfan, a good soldier, married to the worthy and honorable lady Maria de Estrada. Cortez then required of him a number of Indian laborers to open the canals in order to bring his vessels to the lake. He also explained to him his plan of attacking Mexico, to which the young prince offered assistance to the utmost of his power. Our captains at this time assigned to their different posts in case of a sudden attack upon our quarters, the reigning prince of Mexico frequently sending out his troops upon the lake in expectation of taking us unprepared. Some neighboring people, whose district is called Guatinchan, and who had been guilty of offenses in the murders of our countrymen, now petitioned for and obtained pardon. The work upon the canals went on most rapidly, as we never had less than from 7,000 to 8,000 Indians employed. Codlavaca, laid upon the throne of Mexico, was lord of Itzapalapa, the people whereof were bitter enemies to us, and are declared allies of Chalco, Tamalanco, Meca, and Chimaloacan. As we had been 12 days in Tezcuco, so large a force caused some scarcity of provisions. Idleness had also made our allies grow impatient, and for those reasons it became necessary to take the field. Cortez therefore proceeded toward Itzapalapa at the head of 13 cavalry, 220 infantry, and a whole body of our Indian confederates. The inhabitants had received a reinforcement of 8,000 Mexicans. As we approached, they fell back into the town. But this was all a concerted plan. They then fled into their canoes with the reeds by the side of the lake, and also to those houses which were in the water, where they remained quietly, leaving us in possession of that part of the town which is on the firm land. As it was now night, we posted our guards, and were reposing contentedly in our quarters, when all of a sudden there came on us such a body of water by the streets and into the houses, that if our friends from Tezcuco had not called us to that moment, we should have all been drowned, for the enemy had cut the banks of the canals, and also a causeway, whereby the place was laid under water as it were instantaneously. As it happened, 2 of our allies only lost their lives, but all our powder was destroyed, and we were glad to escape with a good wetting. We passed the night badly enough, being supperless and very cold. But what provoked us most was the laughter and mockings of the Indians upon the lake. Worse than this, however, happened to us, for large bodies from the garrison of Mexico, who knew of the plan, crossed the water and fell on us at daybreak with such violence that it was with difficulty we could sustain their attacks. They killed 2 soldiers and 1 of our horses, and wounded a great many. Our allies also suffered a considerable loss on this occasion. The enemy being at length beaten off, we returned to Tezcuco in a very bad humor, having acquired little fame or advantage by our expedition. 2 days after our return from our last expedition, the people of 3 neighboring districts, via Tezcuco, Amtumba, and another which I do not recollect, sent to solicit pardon for the offenses they had committed, excusing themselves by alleging the commands of Codlavaca. Cortez, making a merit of necessity, gave them a free pardon, knowing very well he was not in a situation to do otherwise. The people also of that place called Venezuela, or Little Venice, who had always been at enmity with the Mexicans, now solicited our alliance, a circumstance highly useful from the situation of that town within the lake, and they promised also to bring over their neighbors to us. Intelligence was soon received that large bodies of Mexican troops had fallen upon the districts in an alliance with us, the inhabitants of which, being afraid to remain at home, were flying to the woods or to our quarters for protection. Cortez ordered out 20 cavalry and 200 infantry, 23 musketeers and crossbowmen included. Taking Alvarado and Dioli with him, proceeded to the towns of Huatinchan and Huachutlan. The reports appeared to have foundation, but the real cause of contention was the crop of Indian corn on the borders of the lake, which was now fit to reap, and from which the people of Tezcuco and the others supplied our provisions. But the Mexicans also laid claim to it, and it appeared that the produce of those fields went to the priests of Mexico. Cortez told them to inform him that they thought it necessary to cut the corn, and accordingly at that time a body of 100 or upwards of our soldiers attended by the Allies, went out to cover the reapers. I was twice on that duty and once had a skirmish. The Mexicans crossed over in upwards of 1,000 canoes and attacked us in the maize fields, but we and our allies drove them back to their boats, with the loss of one soldier of ours killed and many wounded. They fought like men and left behind them 20 dead, and we took 5 prisoners. At this time, other neighboring districts solicited our alliance. We here received intelligence that the Mexican forces and their allies of that neighborhood were ready and in the field. Cortes therefore warned us to be alert, and early the next morning after Mass we proceeded on our march, our route being between 2 ridges of rocks, the summits of which were fortified and garrisoned. The enemy endeavored by outcries and reproaches to draw us to an attack. But we pursued our march by a large town named Guatzapeque, which we found abandoned, and passing through we arrived at a plain where were some very scanty fountains of water, and hard by was a great rock with a fortress on the summit. We observed it to be filled with troops, who saluted us on our approach with shouts, showers of stones and arrows, by the first discharge of which they wounded 3 of our soldiers. Cortes then ordered us to halt, and observing that the Mexicans seemed to despise us for not attacking them, he sent a party of cavalry to examine the rock. On their return, they told the general that no part seemed to them so accessible as that where we were. Cortes then ordered us to ascend, Ensign Cristobal de Corral with the colors leading us, and Cortes with the cavalry remaining in the plain to protect the rear. When we began to ascend the mountain, the Indians threw down very large masses of rock, and it was dreadful to see them rolling among us, and wonder how many of us escaped as they bounded over us. The order was a very inconsiderate one, and very unlike a wise captain. One soldier, though he wore a helmet, was killed at my foot, and never uttered a word. His name was Martin Valenciano. As we continued to ascend, the stones still came rolling down upon us, and 2 more soldiers, one named Gaspar Sanchez, nephew of the treasurer of Cuba, and the other named Bravo, were the next who lost their lives, and immediately after Alonso Rodriguez was killed, and 2 more knocked down. Most of the rest received wounds, but we still ascended. I was at that time an alive young man, and followed close to our ensign, taking advantage of the concavities that we found from time to time in the rock. Corral was wounded in the head, his face covered with blood, and the colors tattered to pieces. "O Senor Bernal Diaz del Castillo," he said to me, "here is no advancing. Remain under cover, for it is as much as I can do to keep my hold and preserve myself from falling." Looking downward, I at this time perceived Pedro Barba, captain of the crossbowmen, with 2 soldiers climbing up as we had done under the cover of the projections in the face of the rock. I called to him not to advance, for that it was almost impossible to climb much farther. He replied in lofty terms that I should desist from talking and proceed on. I was a little piqued at this, and exerting my utmost activity, mounted to a considerable distance higher, telling him I should see how he would do. At this moment a shower of large rocks came down, and crushed one of the soldiers who were with Barbara to death, and having seen which he did not stir a step. Corral called out to those below, desiring them to report the general of the impossibility of proceeding, and that even the descent was full of danger. When Cortes was informed of this, he could not see us on account of the inequalities of the rocks, and understood that most of us were wounded and many killed, a circumstance which he could the readier believe from having had 3 of the cavalry captain killed on the plain by the rolling down of the masses of rocks, 7 also be wounded in the same manner. He gave signals for us to descend, which we accordingly did in a very bloody and bruised condition, leaving 8 of our party dead. Bodies of the Mexicans were watching us during this time, concealed in different places, in order to fall upon us when we were engaged in the attack, for it was a concerted plan. They now shewed themselves and advanced against us. We attacked them in the plain and drove them to some other ridges of rocks, and advancing through narrow passes like roads between them, we found another very strong fortress, similar to that we had just been repulsed. We now desisted for the present, and returned to our former position in order to procure water, the men and horses not having drank during the whole day. We found some springs at the foot of the rock, but the numbers of the enemy had drained them and left nothing but mud. We then proceeded to the other fortress which we had observed. There was a distance of about 1.5 leagues between the 2. Here in a grove of mulberry trees we found a fountain, but very scanty of water, and under these trees we halted for some time. At the foot of the rock, whereon the fort was, stood a small village. The people above began at our approach to shoot at us, and appeared in much more considerable numbers than in the former place, and their situation was such that no shot from us could take effect upon them. For some distance from the level ground there was an appearance of pass up the rock, but it altogether presented extreme difficulties. On the ensuing day we attacked our principal body, climbing the rock very slowly but with great fatigue, nor could we have ever ascended to the works, for they were wounding and destroying us by rolling down mates of rock on our head. But that, fortunately for us, was within shot of the post of another rock which commanded it, and to this all our firearms and crossbowmen were detached. And although they were rather too far off to have much effect, yet having killed several of the enemy over their ramparts, it threw them off their defense, and they offered to summit. Cortes called for 5 of their chiefs to descend, and reprehending them for having been the aggressors, he told them that he would pardon them on condition they induced those who were in the other fortress to give themselves up, which they undertook to do. Cortes then ordered the 2 captains, Juan Jaramillo and Pedro de Urcio, and the ensign Corral to ascend to the fort which had been surrendered, bidding me accompany them, and he at the same time warned us not to touch a single grain of mane. This expression I considered as implying that we should do ourselves what good we had in our power. We found it to consist of an extensive plain on the summit of a perpendicular rock. The entrance was by an aperture not much larger than twice the side of the mouth of the oven. It was completely filled with men, women, and children, but they had not a single drop of water, and about 20 of their warriors were killed and many wounded. Their property was all packed up in bales, and here also was a considerable tribute collected in order to be sent to Mexico. I had brought 4 of my Indian servants with me, and began to load them, and also 4 of the natives, upon which Captain de Ircio came and told me to lay down the packs immediately, and he would report me to the general, asking if I had not heard his orders not to touch a grain of maize. I replied that I had heard the orders of the maize should not be taken, and that was the reason why I took the packages, and he would not suffer any of it to go. And on our return, reported me to Cortes, expecting I should receive blame. But Cortes was not so disposed, saying on the contrary that he was sorry I had not got the spoil, and that the dogs should keep their property and laugh at us, and after all the mischief which they had done. De Urcio on this wished to return thither, but Cortes told him that the time did not then admit of it. By this, the chiefs had arrived from the first fortress, the garrison of which agreed to submit, and we returned, being compelled by want of water, to the town of Guatepeque, where was the noble garden I had before mentioned. In this garden our whole force lodged for the night. I certainly never had seen one of such magnificence, and Cortes and the treasurer Alderete, after they had walked through and examined it, declared that it was admirable and equal to any they had ever seen in Castile. Cortes at this time determined to lay an ambuscade, and accordingly set out with 10 of the cavalry and 4 servants. He soon fell in with a party of Mexicans who had fled before him, and imprudently pressing them too far, a large body of their warriors started out upon him, and in their first attack wounded all the horses, and getting 2 of the attendants of Cortes in their hands, carried them to Mexico to be sacrificed, the rest having the most narrow escape. Our main body reached the headquarters at Tacuba with the baggage in safety. Not hearing anything of Cortes or his party of cavalry, we suspected some misfortune. Alvarado, Dioli, Tapia, and I, and some more, therefore, went in search of him, towards that part whither we saw them go, and we soon met 2 of his servants, who informed us of what had happened. In a short time Cortes came upon us. He was very sad and weeping. When we arrived at our quarters in Tacuba, it rained heavily, and we remained under it for 2 hours in some large enclosed courts. The general, with his captains, the treasurer, our reverend father, and many others of us, mounted to the top of the temple which commanded all the lake, and afforded a most surprising and pleasing spectacle, from the multitude of cities rising as it were out of the water, and the innumerable quantity of boats employed in fishing, or rapidly passing to and fro. All of us agreed in giving glory to God for making us the instruments of rendering such services. The reverend father also consoled Cortes, who was very sad on account of his late loss. When we contemplated the scenes of what had happened to us in Mexico, and which we could well trace from where we stood, it made Cortes much more sad than before. It was on this that the romance was written, which begins, "In Tacuba it was Cortes, with many a gallant chief. He thought upon his losses, and bowed his head with grief." One of our soldiers, the bachelor Alonso Perez, who was afterwards fiscal near Mexico, in order to console him, observed that those things were the common fortune of war, and they should not at present compare him to Nero viewing Rome on fire. Cortes answered that he was only sad from the reflection of the dangers and fatigues that we should have to go through, but that he would shortly put his hand to the business. Our captains and soldiers now consulted whether it would not be eligible to take a view of the causeway, but it was thought not prudent, and we continued our march by Escapulzaco, which was abandoned, to Tenayuca, where, in the great temple, they worshipped 3 serpents. From this place, which was also abandoned, we proceeded to Guatitlan, and during the whole day's march it never ceased raining, whereby, together with the weight of our arms, we came in dreadfully fatigued. The enemy gave us some alarms in the night, during which it rained heavily, no watch being kept by us on account of the severity of the weather, as I can testify, my post not having been visited either by Rounds or Corporal. Marching through 4 or 5 towns which were abandoned, by a road deep in mud, we arrived in 2 days more at Aculman in the district of Tezcuco, where we found that a reinforcement to our army had newly arrived from Castile. On the next day, we proceeded to Tezcuco and arrived fatigued, worn out, and diminished in numbers. A conspiracy against the life of Cortez was at this time formed by an adherent to the governor of Cuba, one Antonio de Villafana, native of Zamora or of Toro, and some of the other soldiers of Narvaez, whose names I will not mention. The assassination was to have been executed in the following manner. A vessel having lately arrived from Castile, a letter was to be brought to the general, as from his father, and as if it had come by that opportunity, which letter was to be delivered as he sat at table with his officers and soldiers. And when he had opened, and when was in their act of reading it, the conspirators were to fall on and assassinate him with their poignards, together with all of us who were in his company. When everything was arranged, the conspirators communicated their intentions to two principal persons whom I will not name, but who had been on the expedition with us, one of whom, on the death of Cortez, they meant to have appointed captain general. The offices of alguazil mayor, ensign, alcaldes, regidor, contador, treasurer, vidor, and others of this kind were to have been filled up from among the soldiers of Narvaez, and they had divided amongst them our properties and horses. The business was discovered 2 days after our arrival in Tezcuco by God's mercy, who did not choose that New Spain should have been so lost. For if we had been put to death, all of it would have fallen into confusion and faction. It seems a faithful soldier made the discovery to Cortez, who immediately took proper steps to prevent the mischief from spreading, for he understood it to be conducted by persons of quality. As soon as it was made clear to him, he gave large rewards for the information. He then communicated to all our captains, namely Alvarado, de Lugo, de Oli, Sandoval, and Tapia, and also to me, and the two alcaldes of that year, Luis Martin and Pedro de Urcio, in short, to all of his party. As soon as we knew of it, we prepared ourselves and attended Cortez to the quarters of Villafana, where we found him and many others of the conspirators. The 4 alguazils seized Villafana. The others attempted to escape by flight, but Cortez ordered them to be detained, and some of them he committed to prison. Cortez then took from the bosom of Villafana a paper with the signatures of those who were concerned with him, in consideration for whom, however, he caused the report to be circulated, that it had been swallowed by Villafana without having seen it. He was immediately put upon his trial. By voluntary made a confession, according to which, to the testimony of many witnesses, he was condemned by his judges, the 2 alcaldes, conjointly with Cortez and Dioli, who sat by virtue in his office. Shortly after his condemnation, having confessed himself to the Reverend Father Juan Diaz, he was hanged from a window of the apartment. Of the several others who were arrested, no more were proceeded against, enough having been done, for example, in intimidation. Cortez, however, to prevent such attempts in future, thought it prudent to appoint a guard for his person, composed of valiant and faithful soldiers. They were selected from those who had been with him from the first, and were commanded by a gentleman named Antonio de Quinones. Henceforward, although he showed great attention to those who had been in the conspiracy and treated them in the best manner, he took care to be on his guard with them. At this time came out an order for all the prisoners to be brought to an appointed place in order to be marked. Not to take up time with repetitions of the story, I will sum up in all but one observation, which is, that if what is ill done the first time, the worst done the second, the third was worst of all. For after the royal fifth had been drawn out, Cortez took his own, and then came no less than 30 successive drafts for the captains. Besides, those handsome and good female prisoners, which we put in to be marked, were stolen out of the crowd, and were kept concealed until it was no longer inconvenient to produce them. The brigantines were now finished, and the canal brought to a sufficient width and depth to float them to the lake. Cortez therefore issued a circular notice to all the districts of our alliance in the neighborhood of Tezcuco to send him each within the space of 8 days 8,000 arrowheads made of copper, also an equal number of shafts of a particular wood. By the expiration of the given time, the whole number was brought, executed to a degree of perfection which exceeded the pattern. Captain Barbara, also who commanded the crossbowmen, ordered each of his soldiers to provide themselves with 2 cords and nuts, and to prove the range of their bows. For one of the last ships which came from Castile had brought out a supply of the materials to make cords, and also of powder. Cortez ordered the cavalry to have their lances well pointed, and to use their horses to daily exercise. And he at this time sent an express to Zicotanga the Elder, otherwise Don Lorenzo de Vargas, for 20,000 of the warriors of his nation, and those of Guachocingo and Cholula. He sent similar notices to Chalco and Talmalhanco, summoning them to a general rendezvous on the day after the Feast of the Holy Ghost, at which time Don Hernando, our ally of Tezcuco, was also to join us with all his forces. On the day after the festival of the Holy Ghost, Cortez inspected his army in the large quadrangles of Tezcuco. They mounted to 84 cavalry, 650 infantry with sword and buckler or lances, 194 musketeers and crossbowmen. Out of this number, he took for the service of his fleet 12 of the musketeers and crossbowmen, and 12 of the other infantry for rowers, under the command of a captain to each vessel. He also distributed 20 cannoneers through the whole fleet, which he armed with guns fit for the service we had in our stores. Having thus distributed this force, Cortez gave the following orders. First, no person to utter any blasphemy against our Lord Jesus Christ, the Holy Virgin his mother, the holy apostles, nor any other of the saints under heavy penalties. Second, no soldier to ill-treat our allies in their persons or properties. Third, no soldier to absent himself from his quarters on any pretense. Fourth, every soldier to be fully provided with arms offensive and defensive. Fifth, no soldier to stake his horse or arms at gaming. Sixth, no soldier to sleep without armor or without his weapons beside him, except in case of wounds or sickness. Lastly, penalty of death for sleeping on or absence from a sentinel's post, absence from quarters without leave, quitting the ranks in the field, or flight in battle. Although a number of our people had served as sailors before, there was a great averseness to the present occasion among them to act as rowers. The general was therefore obliged to make an enquiry, and considering all those who belonged to or who were natives of Palos, Mogur, Triano, El Puerto, or any other seaport, who had also been known to have been employed in fishing as being of the profession, he ordered them to the oars, although many of these brought their gentility as an objection, and he would hear none of it, but enforced his orders, by which he obtained 150 who were, as it will appear in the sequel, better situated than any of us who had to bear the weight and dangers of the field. The crews being embarked, each brigantine hoisted a royal standard, and also its peculiar one. At this time arrived the army of our allies of Tlaxcala under the command of the younger Xicotenga. He brought with him his two brothers. In this army also came some of the warriors of Cholula and Guacho Chinga, but not in any considerable number. The alacrity of the whole body appeared in their arrival a day previous to that appointed. They advanced in a great parade, each chief having a standard with their national device, a white spread eagle embroidered upon it. They entered the town in high spirits, shouting, "Castilla, Castilla, Tlaxcala, Tlaxcala, live the emperor." And it was about 3 hours from the time of the arrival of their advanced party until the rear had come in. Cortez, with many compliments, dismissed them to their quarters, and promising to make them all rich on their return to their native country. We now heard that Mexicans had put to death 3 of our soldiers who had been left by Pizarro in search for mines, one only, named Barrientos, escaping to Chinanta, where he was protected. Our general made his disposition for the attack upon the city of Mexico as follows. Pedro de Alvarado, with 150 infantry, 30 cavalry, 18 musketeers and crossbowmen, and 8,000 Tlaxcalans, was to take post at Tacuba, having to assist him Jorge de Alvarado, his brother Gutierre de Badajo, and Andres de Monororas, each of whom was a captain of a company consisting of 50 infantry, and a third of the crossbowmen and musketeers, the cavalry being commanded by Alvarado in person. To this detachment I was appointed. Dioli, having under him captains de Tapia, Verdugo, Lugo, 30 cavalry, 175 infantry, 20 musketeers and crossbowmen, and 8,000 Indians, was to take post at Coyoacan, and Sandoval with captains, 24 cavalry, 150 infantry, 14 musketeers, and upwards of 8,000 Indians, was to take his post at Iztapalapa. The 2 first named divisions were to march by the right, the third in the opposite direction. Sandoval's party also had orders not to march until Cortez, who commanded the flotilla in person, should launch out upon the lake. The enemy gave notice by their noises that they were about us in great numbers, and our 2 detachments, it was settled, should on the ensuing day go to cut the aqueduct of Chapultepec. At the time appointed, we set out with our allies, and though the enemy attacked us in our march, we succeeded, destroying the pipes, so that from that day no more fresh water came to Mexico. It was now determined to try our fortune against the city, and see if we could not at least get possession of a bridge upon the causeway of Tacuba. When we arrived there, the immense number of boats and of their troops on the land was a subject of astonishment. By the first volley of their arrows they killed 3 and wounded 30 of our soldiers. Nevertheless, we advanced to the bridge, the enemy, as it were by stratagem, receding, and now we were upon a causeway 20 feet wide, exposed as a butt to the arrows of those on the water to both of our flanks. Our musketry and crossbows had no effect whatever on their canoes, as they were so well protected. As to the cavalry, their hounds were all wounded, and if they pursued the enemy a little distance on the causeway, they were stopped by the parapets which they had built across it, and which they defended with long lances. and when our infantry advanced against them in front, the enemy threw themselves into the water. Thus we were fighting them for upwards of an hour, their numbers increasing from every part of the lake, and our allies only encumbering the causeway. Being utterly unable to resist the enemy who were on the water, we determined to retire, which we did, leaving 8 dead and having above 50 wounded, the enemy pursuing us closely. On the ensuing day, Dioli proceeded with his detachment for Coyoacan. He talked in terms of disapprobation of the preceding expedition, laying the blame on the rashness of Alvarado. We were all solicitous that the two captains should remain together, and certainly their separation was very imprudent, for had the enemy known of the smallness of our number, they would have fallen on and destroyed either detachment during the 4 or 5 days that we were separated, and before the arrival of Cortez with the flotilla. In these two positions our detachments remained for the above period, without venturing to pay another visit to the Mexican causeways. During this time the enemy frequently sent bodies of their troops to the mainland and annoyed us with attacks in our quarters. Sandoval with his detachment left Tezcuco on the 4th day after the feast of Corpus Christi, and marching through a friendly country, arrived in front of the town of Itzapalapa. On his arrival he immediately attacked the enemy in that place and burned many of the houses which were built on the firm ground. But fresh bodies of Mexicans came by both land and water to their relief. While thus occupied, our troops observed a smoke to rise from the top of a hill above the town, which was answered in the same manner at other points round the lake. And thus we found to be a signal for the information to the enemy that our flotilla was launched, a circumstance which occasioned them to relax in their hostilities against Sandoval. He now remained unmolested in his insulated situation in a part of the town of Itzapalapa, between which and Coyoacan there were no means of communication but by a causeway which crosses the lake, and the passage of which was impracticable in the face of the enemy. Cortez, when he brought his flotilla on the lake, first went to attack a rock which forms a small island just by Mexico, and on which many of the natives, as well of that neighborhood as of other parts, had taken refuge. As soon as the enemy discovered his intention, their whole force from every part of the lake proceeded against him. When our general perceived the immense number of large boats full of fighting men, for it exceeded 4,000, he drew his flotilla into an open part of the lake, and ordered his captains to wait patiently for a breeze of wind which was just then beginning to spring up. The enemy, thinking this was owing to fear, began to close round him with great triumph, and just at this moment, the wind rising in his favor, the whole fleet set sail, plying their oars at the same time, bearing down upon the Mexican canoes in this manner. They sunk a number of them, and compelled the rest to take shelter in the recesses on the sides of the lake. After this, Cortez sailed for Coyoacan. Here he had another attack by the Mexicans, who assailed his vessels from the temples on the land, as well as with their canoes. But he brought 4 guns to bear upon them, and did considerable execution, although by some mismanagement of gunners his powder magazine blew up, wounding many of his people. This misfortune obliged him to detach his lightest vessel to Sandoval for a supply. At Coyoacan he remained with the flotilla for 2 days, and here I will leave him to relate what passed in the detachment of Alvarado. When we perceived that the flotilla was upon the lake, we marched out upon the causeway as far as the bridge, where we passed our time in a repetition of engagements with the enemy, but to little effect, farther than repairing the passes in our rear as we advanced. Nor did we now suffer the cavalry to come to the causeway. Sandoval had found that his position he could not sufficiently annoy the enemy, who were established in the houses built in the water. He therefore advanced to a causeway, to a place which commanded them better. This being perceived from Mexico, a large detachment was sent in canoes with directions to cut the causeway behind the troops. Cortez, observing this, set sail with his vessels for their relief, ordering Dioli to go thither with a body of troops by the causeway. Having relieved Sandoval, the general ordered this detachment to a place named Tepeaquilla, which is now built the church of Nuestra Senora de Guadalupe, in which many wonderful miracles have been and are performed. As it was impossible for our troops to advance upon the causeways without their flanks being secured on the water, the flotilla was formed into 3 divisions, and one of them attached to each of the 3 corps of our army. That is to say, 4 ships to Alvarado, 6 to Dioli, and 2 to Sandoval, making in all 12, for the 13th, named Busca Ruida, or Follow the Noise, being found to be too small, was ordered to be laid up and her crew divided among the rest, as we had 20 very badly wounded already upon the ships. Alvarado now ordered us out upon the causeway, and placing 2 of his ships on each side, he thereby protected the flanks. We drove the enemy from several bridges and barricades, but after fighting during the whole day, we were obliged at night to retreat to our quarters, almost every man of us wounded by the showers of arrows and stones, which exceeded imagination, for we were attacked constantly by fresh troops bearing different devices by land, while from the terraces of the houses the enemy commanded our ships. As we could not leave a party to secure what we got in that day, at night the enemy repossessed themselves of the bridges and put better defenses on them. They deepened the water in 4 places, and in the shallow part they dug pits and placed canoes in ambuscade, which they secured from attacks of our vessels by palisades under the water. This was the manner in which they opposed us every day. The cavalry, as I had before observed, could do nothing. The enemy had built parapets across the causeways, which they defended with long lances, and even had an attack been practicable, the soldiers would not risk their horses, which at this time cost 800 crowns, some more than 1,000, nor indeed were they to be had at any price. When we arrived at night, we were employed in curing our wounds, and a soldier named Juan Catalan also healed them by charms and prayers, which, with the mercy of our Lord Jesus, recovered us very fast. But wounded or not, we were obliged to go against the enemy every day, as otherwise our companies would not have been 20 men strong. When our allies saw that the before-mentioned soldier cured us by charms and prayers, all of their wounded came to him, so that he had more business on his hands than he knew what to do with. Every day our ensign was disabled, not having it in his power to carry the colors and defend himself. Corn we had sufficiency of, but we wanted refreshments for the wounded. What preserved us was the plant called quilites, cherries while in season, and tunas or Indian figs. The situation of our other parties round the lake was similar to what I have here described. The enemy in the city ruffled out on signal being made from the top of the great temple of Talticluco, and these attacks were made every day and repeated by fresh troops who were formed and marched out in succession. Finding that we gained so little and lost so much, we resolved to change our plan of operations. There was on our causeway a very small open place where there were some buildings for religious worship. Here we established a post and lodged ourselves, although very badly, as every shower of rain came in on us, leaving our cavalry and Indian allies to secure our rear in Tacuba, from which place we were supplied with bread. From this time, as we advanced, we filled the water cuts which intersected the causeway and prostrated the houses which were on each side of it, for it was exceedingly difficult to let them on fire, nor could the flames communicate from one to another on account of the water which was between them. And if we threw ourselves into the water to swim to a house, the enemy destroyed us from their terraces. We guarded every pass day and night when we gained it, and our method of keeping guard was as follows. I'm going to skip forward here. This is to page 294. The people of the cities in the lake, growing tired of this warfare, waited on Cortes at this time in order to make submission, declaring that they had been forced into hostility by the Mexicans. Cortes received them with affability, gave them assurances of protection according to their behavior, and at the same time told them that he expected their assistance in the supply of boats and provisions, and in erecting barracks for the troops. This they promised readily, but performed very badly. Cortes had huts built for his detachment, but the rest remained exposed to the weather, a very severe duty in itself in that climate, which during the months of June, July, and August, it rains continually. On the next morning, therefore, having heard Mass and recommending ourselves to God, our 3 detachments marched against the enemy's pods in their front. Those commanded by Cortes and Sandoval met with less violent opposition than that which fell to the lot of the division of Alvarado, to which I belonged. In our attack upon the first dike, most of the Spaniards received wounds. 1 was killed, and above 1,000 of our allies killed or wounded. Cortes at first bore down all before him, having driven the enemy from a post where the water was very deep and the causeway very narrow, and was induced to pursue them in their retreat to the city, his Indian allies crowding close after the Spaniards. The enemy induced him by frequent halts and feigned attacks to continue the pursuit, and the causeway had been narrowed to answer their design. It was the will of our Lord that Cortes and his captains should be so negligent as to omit filling the ditch which they had passed. The causeway was also in some parts covered with water and in deep mud. When the enemy saw our Cortes thus run deep into the trap which they had laid, multitudes in canoes sallied out against him and took him on his flanks and rear, his own vessels not being able to approach on account of the palisades. It now became necessary for the troops to retreat, which they did at first with great regularity, but when they came to the narrow pass, as I before have mentioned, the difficulty of the ground, and with the fury of the attack, from a retreat it turned into a race, our people flying before the enemy without attempting to defend themselves. Our Cortes used every exertion to rally them, but in vain. He received a wound in the leg from the enemy on board the canoes at the pass, where they killed 6 of our horses and carried off 72 Spaniards alive. 6 chiefs seized upon Cortes, but it was the will of God that he should escape, for that valiant soldier, Cristobal de Olea, seeing his general's danger, flew to his assistance, as did another brave man called Lerma. Olea, with his own hand, killed 4 of the 6 Mexican chiefs, gallantly losing his own life in defense of his general. and Lerma escaped with the greatest difficulty. Other soldiers now arrived to the assistance of Cortez. Amongst the number was Quinones, captain of his guards. They took him out of the water in their arms, and placing him on a horse, hurried him off from the crowd of enemies. And shortly after, his major domo, named Cristobal de Guzman, brought one of his own horses for him. The enemy followed up their attack with ardor, and the unfortunate Guzman, being seized by them, was carried alive to Mexico. Cortez and the shattered remains of his troops, pursued to the last, arrived with great difficulty at their quarters. I will leave them for the present to relate what happened in the division commanded by Alvarado. After our first attack, wherein we defeated the enemy, as we were advancing, we were met by fresh troops in great parade, bearing plumes of feathers and devices on their standards. When we came near them, they threw down before us 5 bleeding heads, crying out to us that they were those of Cortez and his officers, and that we should meet the same fate with our companions. They then marched up, and fighting us foot to foot, compelled us to retreat. We, as usual, called to our allies to clear the way for us, but in the present case there was no occasion. The sight of the bloody heads had done it effectually, nor did one of them remain on the causeway to impede our retreat. Before we arrived at our quarters, and while the enemy was pursuing us, we heard their shrill timbrels and the dismal sound of the great drum from the top of the principal temple of the god of war, which overlooked the whole city. Its mournful noise was such as may be imagined the music of the infernal gods, and it might be heard at the distance of almost 3 leagues. They were then sacrificing the hearts of 10 of our companions to their idols. Shortly after this, the king of Mexico's horn was blown, giving notice to his captains that they were then to take their enemies prisoner or die in the attempt. It is impossible to describe the fury which they closed upon us when they heard this signal. Though all is as perfect to my recollection as if passing before my eyes, it is utterly beyond my power to describe. All I can say is it was God's will that we should escape from their hands and get back to the safety of our post. Praise be he for his mercies now and at all other times. Our new allies on the lake had suffered considerably by the enemy, having lost half their canoes, but they continued firm to us, from animosity to them, or contented themselves with being mere lookers-on and did not molest us. Cortez, in consequence of our losses, ordered a cessation of attacks, which lasted for the space of 4 days, during which we did not quit our posts, having lost near 80 men and 7 horses in the last engagement. The enemy also gained ground on us, and made new ditches and water cuts, but we had a very deep and defensible one in front of our quarters. Sandoval and Tapia, on their return to the general, reported to him the valiant manner in which our soldiers were behaving when they arrived at our post. Sandoval also mentioned me particularly, and said those things in my commendation, which, exclusive of the facts being known to our whole army, would not be proper to repeat of myself. During this cessation, our whole force of infantry kept guard on the causeway at night, flanked by the brigantines, one half the cavalry patrolling in Tacuba, the other half on the causeway. In the morning we were prepared to receive the enemy, who every day continued sacrificing our poor companions, and when they attacked, reviled us, saying that our flesh was too bitter to be eaten, and truly it seems that such a miracle was wrought. For 5 days together the enemy continued their assaults, being promised, as they said, our destruction by their gods, within the space of 8 days. But their gods, as it appears to me, were perverse and treacherous to them, not permitting them to think of peace, and thus leading them to ruin. This language, however, and the last menace in particular, had such an effect upon our allies, together with the bad appearance of our affairs, that they almost entirely deserted us in the course of a night. During each night of this period, the enemy continued beating their accursed drum in the great temple. Nothing can equal the dismal impression its sound conveyed. They were then in the execution of their infernal ceremonies. The whole place was illuminated, and their shrieks at certain intervals pierced the air. For 10 nights together they were thus employed in putting to death our unfortunate companions. Cristobal de Guzman was the last sacrificed. He was in their hands 18 days. This we were informed of by some of our prisoners, and for every sacrifice we were told that their war god renewed to them the promise of victory. The enemy at times during the foregoing period brought our own crossbows against us, and made the unfortunate prisoners shoot them, but our post derived its safety from the excellent management of 2 guns under Medrano. And we still advanced, gaining every day a bridge or a parapet. Our vessels also continually intercepted their canoes loaded with provision and water, also those of which were employed in procuring that nutritive substance by which dry resembles cheese, and is found at the bottom of the lake. In this manner of proceeding 12 or 13 days had now passed. Our lives therefore exceeded the date allowed them by the prediction of the Mexican priests. This gave our allies courage, and in compliance with the requisition of our steady friend Suchel, 2,000 warriors from Tezcuco returned to us. Our general thought the present a good juncture to offer peace to the Mexicans. He therefore proposed to 3 of his principal prisoners to go with his message to their king, Guatemotzin, but they declined it, alleging that he would certainly put them to death. At length, however, he prevailed with them to carry his proposal, which was to this purport, that from the affectation he bore to all the family of the great Montezuma, in order to prevent the destruction of that great city and the loss of lives, he was willing to treat of peace, calling for the recollection of Guatemotzin, that his troops and people were cut off from provisions and water, and all those nations which had formerly been vassals of Mexico were now the allies of the Spaniards, and with many more strong arguments of the same purpose, which the ambassadors very well understood. Previous to their going, they desired that the general would provide them with a letter, under which authority they waited on the monarch, sobbing and wailing bitterly, as knowing the danger which attended their business. At first Guatemotzin and his chiefs appeared enraged, but the moderation of his disposition prevailed, and he resolved to call a council composed of the princes, chiefs, and priests of the city. Guatemotzin opened the business by expressing his own inclination to come into terms, exposing the inefficacy of their resistance, the desertion of their allies, and the distresses of the people. The priests took the opposite position. They represented the conduct of the Spaniards from the first, their treatment of his uncle, the great Montezuma, of Cacamatzin, and of various other princes as soon as they had got them in their power, and also the death of the two sons of Montezuma, which they laid to their charge, the destruction and waste of the wealth of Mexico, and the marks of slavery with which they had branded other nations. They reminded him of his own martial fame and conduct, of the insidiousness of Cortes and his officers, and of the promises of victory they had obtained from their gods. Guatemotzin then expressed his determination to fight to the last man and gave orders to spare the provisions as much as possible, to sink wells in various places, and to endeavor to obtain supplies by night. Our army remained at their posts for 2 days quietly, expecting the answer from Mexico. We were then attacked at all points by great bodies of the enemy, who fell on us like lions, closing upon and endeavoring to seize us into their hands whenever the horn of Guatemotzin was sounded. For 7 days we were thus engaged, watching in a body during the night, at daybreak going into action, fighting during the day, and in the evening retiring to console ourselves with our misery of maize, cakes, aguy or pepper, tunas, and herbs. Our offer of peace only served for new matter for the enemy to revile us, reproaching us as cowards, and saying that peace was for women and arms for men. It has been mentioned that the wretched remains of our countrymen were sent round to different provinces to summon and encourage them to come to the aid of the Mexicans. In consequence, a force assembled from Matalzingo, Malinalco, and other places at the distance of 8 leagues from Mexico to fall upon our rear, while the enemy from the city attacked us in front. When they had assembled as above mentioned, they began to commit outrages upon the country between them and us, seizing the children in order to sacrifice. Complaints of this coming to Cortes, he detached de Tapia with 20 cavalry and 100 infantry against the enemy. This officer executed his mission completely, driving them back to their own country with loss. Cortes then sent Sandoval to assist the people of the district called Cuernavaca, who were attacked in the same manner. There is much to say in respect to this expedition, too much indeed to do it justice without going into details. Suffice it that it was more peaceable than warlike. Cortes now again sent an embassy to Guatemotzin, saying that he had the monarch's orders to save if possible that fine city. He reminded Guatemotzin of the distress of the wretched people, and to convince him that he had no hope from his allies, he sent the message by 2 chiefs who had accompanied Sandoval. The Mexican monarch returned no answer, excepting ordering the ambassadors immediately to quit the city. The enemy now increased every day the fury of their attacks. Their expressions were Tenotes de Rey Castilla, Tenotes Acaca, which means, what says the king of Castile? What does he now? We still continued advancing towards the heart of the city, and observed that, notwithstanding the rage with which they assailed us, for it seemed as if they wished to meet their deaths, there was not so much movement among them formerly, nor did they so busily employ themselves in opening the ditches. We also had cause for reflection of a less pleasant nature, which was, that our powder was almost reduced to nothing. At this moment, most fortunately, arrived at the port of Villarica a vessel with soldiers and ordnance stores, one of an armament fitted out by the Ion, which had been destroyed or dispersed near the islands of Florida. The relief and reinforcement were immediately forwarded to Cortes by his lieutenant. It was now determined by Cortes and all the army to push for the great palace of Tlatelolco of the city, on account of the principal temples and strong buildings being there. Each of our detachments therefore advanced for the purpose. Cortes got possession of a small square at which were some temples. In those temples were beams, whereupon were placed the heads of many of our soldiers. Their hair and beards had much grown. I could not have believed it had I not seen it with my own eyes, and 3 days after, when our party had advanced near enough to get a few of them, after having filled 2 canals. I recognized the features of 3 of our friends, and tears came into my eyes at the sight. In 12 days they were all buried by us in that which is now named the Church of the Martyrs. The detachment of Alvarado continued to advance, and after an engagement of 2 hours, forced the enemy from their barricades in the great square. The cavalry now rendered good service in the open space, and the enemy were driven before us into the temple of the war god. Alvarado divided his forces into three bodies, and while he occupied the attention of the enemy with two, he ordered the third, commanded by Badajoz, to drive them from and take possession of the great temple. The enemy, headed by their priests, occupied the adoratories or sanctuaries of their idols, and repulsed our troops, driving them down the steps, which being observed by Alvarado, he then sent us to support them. And on our arrival, having ascended to the top, we completely drove the enemy from that post, and having done which, we set fire to the images of their false gods, and planted our standard on the summit of the temple. The view of this signal of victory rejoiced Cortes, who would fain have joined us, but he had it not in his power. He was then distant a quarter of a league, and had many ditches to fill as he advanced. In 4 days from this time, both he and Sandoval had worked their way to us, and the communications to the three posts were opened through the center of the city of Mexico. This attack upon the temple was truly perilous. The edifice was very lofty, and the enemy numerous, and they continued to engage us on the flat ground at the summit from the time that we had set fire to the idols and their adoratories until night. The royal palaces were now leveled to the ground, Guatemotzin and his troops having retired to a quarter of the city, more distant from the center and towards the lake. Still they attacked us in the day, and at night pursued our quarters, and thus time passed over, and no proposition was made concerning peace. Our chiefs then proposed a plan of laying ambuscades. 30 cavalry and 100 infantry of the prime of our army, together with 1,000 Tlascalans, were posted in concealment in some large houses which had belonged to a nobleman of the city. This was done during the night. Cortes, with the rest of his troops, in the morning went to attack the post at a bridge, which Guatemotzin had ordered to be supported by a large force. Cortes, after his first attack, retreated, drawing the enemy after him, by the buildings where the troops were placed in concealment. At the proper moment, he fired 2 shots close together as a signal. We sallied out, and the enemy being enclosed between us, our allies, and the party of Cortes, which faced about, a dreadful havoc was made of them, and from that time they no more annoyed us in our retreat. Another trap was also laid for them by Alvarado, but not with much same success. I was not present at it. Cortes now gave orders to Sandoval to go with the flotilla against that part or nook of the city which Guatemotzin had retired, cautioning him at the same time not to kill or injure any Mexican unless he was attacked, nor even then to do more than was absolutely necessary for his own defense, but to level all the houses and the many advanced works which the enemy had made in the lake. Cortes ascended then into the great temple, with several of his officers and soldiers, to observe the movements of his fleet. When Sandoval approached the quarters of Guatemotzin, that prince, who had great apprehensions of being made prisoner, availed himself of the preparations which he had made for his escape, in embarking himself, his family, his courtiers, and officers, with their most valuable effect, on board 50 large piraguas. The whole body set off for the mainland, as did all his nobility and chiefs in various directions. Sandoval, who was at this time occupied in making his way by tearing down the houses, received immediate notice of the flight of Guatemotzin. He instantly set out in the pursuit, giving strict orders that no injury or insult should be offered, and that each should keep a steady eye upon the royal vessel, and do his utmost to get possession of it. He particularly directed Holguin, his intimate friend and captain, and quicker sailor of the fleet, to make for that part of the shore which Guatemotzin was most likely to go. Accordingly, this officer followed his instructions, and falling in with the vessels, from certain particulars in its appearance, structure, and awning, he ascertained that which the king was on board of. He made signs to the people in it to bring to, but without effect. He then ordered his crossbowmen and musketeers to present, upon which Guatemotzin called out to them not to shoot, and approaching the vessel, acknowledged himself for what he was, declaring his readiness to submit and to go with them to their general, but requesting that his queen, children, attendants should be suffered to remain unmolested. Holguin received him with the greatest respect, together with his queen and 20 of his nobility. He seated them on the poop of his ship and provided refreshments to them, commanding that the piraguas which carried the king's effects should follow untouched. Cortes went forward to meet them, and embracing Guatemotzin, treated him and his attendants with every mark of respect. The unfortunate monarch, with tears in his eyes and sinking under affliction, then addressed him in the following words: "Melanson, I have done that which was my duty in the defense of my kingdom and people. My efforts have failed, and being now brought by force a prisoner in your hands, draw that poniard from your side and stab me to the heart." Cortes embraced and used every expression to comfort him, by assurances that he held him in high estimation for the valor and firmness that he had shown, and that he had required a submission from him and the people at the time that they could no longer reasonably hope for success, in order to prevent further destruction, but that all was past, and no more to be thought of. He should continue to reign over the people as he had done before. Thus was the siege of Mexico brought to a conclusion by the capture of Guatemotzin and his chiefs on the 13th of August, in the hour of Vespers, being the day of Saint Hippolytus, in the year of our Lord 1521. Glorified be our Lord Jesus Christ and our Lady, the Virgin Holy Mary, his blessed Mother. Amen.